I'd like to welcome everyone here to the Mother Colony House, the oldest house in what is now known as Orange County. It was built in 1857 by George Hansen for the Anaheim colony. One of the things I'd like to point out is, as you're standing in front of the house, that it is a wood frame structure. It's the oldest wood frame structure in Orange County, and it's rather unusual for its time period. When people came to this area, there were no woods or logging facilities here, so they could not make their houses very easily from wood. They had to actually import it down from San Francisco area, which is what George Hansen did. But the people that were here looked around and they looked at the resources available, and they discovered that there was something very simple that they could use instead, and it's something we call adobe. And adobe is just taking the available soil or dirt, mixing it with straw and water, and putting it into wood frames and actually creating bricks, which had to be dried in the sun for almost a month. Now, when George Hansen arrived here, he realized he needed shelter from primarily the Santa Ana winds, but also the sun and the heat and the rain when we get it. And he was not able to wait that long, the 4 weeks, for his adobe bricks to actually dry. So he went to the expense of having redwood brought all the way from the San Francisco area. And to a large part, that is why this house is still standing. Because one of the biggest threats to a wood structure is a little insect called a termite, and termites like to eat the wood. Well, one of the types of woods they do not like is actually redwood. And so we've actually been very, very fortunate that this house is still available for public viewing. So now let's go into the Mother Colony House and see what it's like on the inside. So welcome to the George Hansen house. This is a picture of George Hansen, and George Hansen had several very specific jobs that he had to do while he was here for about 2 years, preparing the colony for the Anaheim colonists who were still up in San Francisco for the most part. So he had to actually what we call lay out the town site, and that's something that a surveyor does. George Hansen had a lot of experience as a surveyor for Los Angeles County, and he brought that experience with him. So he laid out the town site, which was enclosed by north, south, east, and west streets. And we happened to be on West Street. So actually, if you had walked across the street in George Hansen's time, you would have been exiting the colony. So George was here, and he used very early surveying equipment, which we have examples of here, but they're actually just as accurate as the ones that nowadays actually depend on the use of satellite imagery. So George laid out the town site, which included 50 vineyard lots, 64 city lots, and not all the streets that we're actually familiar with nowadays. And quite a few of them have actually changed their names over time. For example, Anaheim Boulevard was actually called Los Angeles Street in George Hansen's time, because if you went all the way to the north, as far north as you could, you ended up in Los Angeles, the city of Los Angeles, which was our nearest actual town at that time. Now, George Hansen was living here with quite a few workers, and he would have to actually supervise them. And one of their other jobs, besides laying out the town site, was to bring water to Anaheim. It was very important that we have water here because what we were planning to do was to grow grapes to make wine, and you need water. And this is basically a desert. So the nearest water source is the Santa Ana River. That's about 5.5 miles from this location. And George had already picked a point where he wanted to tie in. It's a little bit higher elevation in order to bring the water here without a single pump. It was really quite an engineering feat to be able to do that. So George was out there with his men who, with shovels, were digging this 5.5-mile ditch, as well as then planting about 400,000 grapevines. That's more than one grapevine for every person living in Anaheim today. So that was quite, again, another undertaking. So George Hansen is living in this house. He's not by himself. He actually has a young couple with a child that stays here. And the reason is they're going to actually take care of the house. They're going to oversee gardens, any kind of livestock, because they had to depend on what they had here in order to feed themselves, especially during this time period. So George Hansen also used this space, which was probably his living room space as well, as his office. And that's really how we have it set up here with his equipment and a desk. Now, the two rooms on either side, which we'll go into more depth with, at that point in time were just bedroom space, and the door that will also be going down into the back portion of this house actually would have led outdoors. So I want you, when you're in this space, I want you to picture it as just this part of the building for George Hansen. So now we're going to enter the bedroom space. So originally this house had 2 bedrooms, one on each end of the house. This one has been set up to look pretty representative of that time period. Now during George Hansen's time, there would have been just a burlap curtain to provide privacy. We have sort of produced some burlap curtains on just to give you a sense of what it would have looked like. Now, one of the things you will have noticed is we have 3 rooms. We have 2 bedrooms and a combined living room office. But there's a few rooms that we're used to having in our homes and apartments that I haven't mentioned, one of which is the bathroom. They did not have indoor plumbing yet at this stage, so most people had what we would call an outhouse. And we do have a representation of that outside the back of this house. But during the night, most people didn't want to have to struggle out of the bed and get a lantern going and then walk to probably the back end of their property because you didn't want it very close to your house, especially during the hot seasons. It's going to start to smell bad very quickly, and you didn't want that to be inside your house. So most people had what we called a chamber pot, which may have just rested underneath your bed. But in this case, we had somebody who was very skilled at carpentry and actually created something called a commode. And a commode is actually this piece of furniture here. And what you see is basically, it looks kind of like a training potty for a child. And it gives you a chance to actually sit down, which would be easier for obviously the ladies of the household. And the chamber pot is actually contained within here. Now, of course, whether the chamber pot is under the bed or inside the commode, it's going to be somebody's responsibility every morning to check to see if it was used because you needed to clean it out and then put it back. This would have been the perfect job for a 3rd grade student. You're exactly the right age to be responsible enough to be very careful when you were carrying it out of the house because you did not want to spill anything on Mama's, beautiful new rug. And also, you weren't going to be teasing your brother and sister on the way out as well. So this was a job for 3rd graders, absolutely. And you would clean it, put it back, and then it would be ready for use the next day. Now, doing laundry would have been a very hard job for Mom primarily to do. She would have had some of the older siblings, probably the girls, helping her. But there was a lot of work involved with it. You had to pump all the water. You had to heat it up very hot. You had made probably your own lye soap, which is going to be very hard on your hands. And you had to hand scrub all the pieces of whatever it is, whether it was dresses, underwear, whatever, and then hand rinse it, hand wring it, put it out in the line, and then everything had to be ironed. So it would actually be probably a whole day of work for the women in the household. So one of the ways they actually at least protected their good clothing was the amount of undergarments that they wore. Now, ladies would have worn pantaloons and what we call a chemise to cover the top part of their body, and then multiple petticoats. And the intention was to keep all the oils and sweat from our bodies from actually penetrating to our good clothing, so that our good clothing would just need an airing and then could be worn probably multiple times before they actually had to be laundered. Now, the men had something else that they would wear. Boys and men would have worn something similar to this, which is long underwear, and again, for the same reason, would have covered your body and helped to prevent the sweat from penetrating penetrating your good clothes so that you could again extend the time between laundries. So we're also very fortunate to have examples of some of the clothing worn by those early Anaheim colonists, and they actually tell you something about what it was like in those days, especially about laundry. For example, a lot of the clothing that you're seeing is actually in a dark color. They're not all black. The little jacket here that a woman would have worn is actually a dark burgundy, and the men's vest here is actually a navy blue. But they are dark colors, and again, it goes back to the fact that it's a lot easier to extend washings in between if you have a dark colored material. So if it gets dusty, you can just brush it off, air it, and wear it again. The other thing is, as we mentioned with the ladies' jacket, there's over 30 buttons on that jacket, and they're glass. So they would have actually had to have been removed prior to laundering them, as well as the lace at cuff and collar, because back then, the colors of the fabric was not what we call fast. It would actually run when it got into hot water. So those would have actually turned pink if you didn't take them off. So you would actually have to basically pretty much take that jacket apart to wash it. You would dry it on the line, and everything has to be ironed because everything, all kinds of fabrics were wrinkly at that point. And then you would have to actually resew on all of those buttons and again the collar and cuffs. So that wasn't going to be something that you'd want to do every week. You might actually want to maybe extend it as much as a month before you had to launder it again. The other very interesting outfit is the dress on the left, which is actually a plaid, a very light plaid, and was actually a wedding dress. And I think one of the things I like to point out is that before Queen Victoria chose to get married in a white wedding gown, and became very popular at that point, ladies wore their best dress, and they would have actually worn it after that for major social events, parties, dances. Wouldn't necessarily have been something that they would have put away. Now, since this bedroom is such a very small space, one of the Victorian inventions that would have been very helpful is this bed here. It's called a cabinet bed. Later on in the 30s, when it was reintroduced, it was called a Murphy bed. And basically what it does is it actually folds up into the top cabinet up here, and it actually then just looks like a mirrored cabinet when it's folded up, but it creates a lot of space here that the family then can use during the day. I did want to point out this lovely hand needlework coverlet that we have here. It's actually in German, and what it says is, "Your heart shall be joyful, eat your bread with thankfulness, for the good word and good drink, it keeps body and soul in fit condition. Every rooster crows better when he can wet his whistle. Enjoy a glass of wine, but not in excess," which would have been something that the Anaheim winemakers would have definitely embraced. Now, one of the other new inventions that would have also been very important to the Anaheim colonists is something called a sewing machine. And we happen to have a great example of it right here. So during this time period in early Anaheim, a lot of mothers with large families would have been dependent on their own skills with sewing in order to clothe their children. And something like a sewing machine, which was a new invention, would have been a great help to them. This one I wanted to point out to you is actually a little bit older than the Mother Colony House. It's from 1850. But I want to point out something to you. There is no electric plug because electricity hasn't been invented yet. What you see down below are two foot-shaped pedals, which indicate that the woman or daughter, whoever was actually doing the sewing, could only sew as fast and as long as she was able to pedal. So I always ask the third graders, if you had to pedal in order to provide power for your video games, television, CD players, do you think you'd actually spend less time with them? So in 1872, a very important lady moved into this house, and her name was Vicenta Yorba Carrillo. And the reason she has so many names is that she was, of course, born into one of the very important rancho families, that's Sepulveda. And then she was married twice to Tomas Yorba and Jose Carrillo. And she outlived both of them, and she had a total of 12 children with those two marriages. Now, when she moved into this house, she was still raising 4 teenagers, 3 girls and a son. And she very successfully married the 3 daughters from this house. And that's why she turned this room into her parlor. She's also the person that put on the back portion of the house, which we'll see in a little bit. And that was for her bedroom spaces. She needed obviously more bedrooms with 5 adult-sized bodies in this house. Now, this is a great picture of her and her 12 surviving children. She lived to quite a nice old age. And her daughter, when this house became a museum in 1929, was nice enough to actually return this lovely lighting fixture, which would have been actually kerosene burning at that time. We've electrified it, obviously, but so that we actually have an actual item that was from one of the families that lived in the Mother Colony house. It's a little bit fancy, I think, for such a little cottage, but again, because this was her parlor, she wanted to have all of her best furniture, her best what we call knickknacks or decorative items in order to impress her guests, because she was going to be entertaining young men and women in order to help her daughters find husbands. And that was pretty much what women were expected to do in those years. You didn't have a lot of alternatives like we have nowadays. So one of the pieces of furniture that we like to point out is this lovely piece right here. It doesn't look unusual until you look very closely at the covering material. It's not made out of the normal fabric that we are used to seeing on covered pieces of furniture like this. It's actually woven horsehair. And actually the stuffing for this couch is also horsehair. They used hair a lot in those days. Number one, they had a lot of horses available, but this is also a very strong material. And when you think about how ladies were dressed in those days with corsets, which had very hard metal and or bone pieces, and would sit on couches like this, you had a lot of opportunity, if you had regular material in here, for there to be tears placed in it. So the horsehair actually is something that would hold up to that kind of wear and tear. And it also looks very pretty. When Mrs. Carrillo had her family in this space and their guests, they were expected to entertain them. Now, in this period before electricity, you couldn't just push a button on a television or a radio and sit back. You were actually going to have to do something. So one of the ways that you could entertain them would be with a piece like this beautiful piano. This is a square grand piano. And for you to entertain your guests and ask them to sing along would have been a very engaging type of entertainment. We also, in case you couldn't afford a piano, have something like a zither. Or in those days, something like a guitar would have been very popular, almost any of the stringed instruments, and for ladies in particular, the harp, because they looked very graceful as they played the harp. So it was a very, very popular instrument with the ladies. Now, you were also given the opportunity to show off some of your skills. So for example, if you baked, you could entertain them by providing them with some cake, some cookies, something like that, or with some crafts that you may have engaged in. Now, ladies in this time period had very long hair, and because they didn't wash their hair very frequently, they would actually do 50 to 100 strokes on their hair every night, and that would help distribute the oils from their scalp to the ends of the hair and keep it very, very healthy. So you would have a nice brush like this, and you would actually brush 100 strokes all the way down. Now, what's going to happen is you are going to have some hairs come loose, and they're going to be stuck in your brush. Well, they did not throw that away. They actually would take that from the brush and they would put it in an item like this that would be on their vanity. It has a hole in the top. It's called a hair receiver, and they would actually put that hair into the receiver. So you can see we have some in there. And they would actually use this for very personal types of gifts. I like to look at some of the items, and we have one here, which is basically what we call a hair wreath that has different colors of hair in it. So it indicates that everybody from different generations has contributed. So grandmother, grandfather with their white or gray hair, mom and dad with their different colors hair, down to the siblings. So you have blonde hair, red hair, all kinds of hair colors represented. Or if you wanted to, you could actually create beautiful jewelry, which would be a very personal gift for somebody like your parents, or as in Mrs. Carrillo's experience, maybe one of her daughters, when they finally found a husband and were engaged, would create this very, very special gift that would remind the bearer of them whenever they used it. So we have things like different kinds of brooches, but also this, which would be something that you could gift a gentleman, which is called a watch chain. And this would actually keep his pocket watch from getting lost. Now, something that would be probably about as close to television as you could get during that time period would be this item here. This is called a stereo viewer, and these are called stereo cards or stereo views, and you'll notice that there are two images side by side, and when they're placed in the stereo viewer and the person actually looks through, it brings them together and it creates a three-dimensional effect. It's very exciting. And on each card, there's a set of cards. Each one has a different part of the story. They all frequently told a story. And if you had a new set of cards and invited people over, they would be very excited. This would be something that would be very interesting to share. Now, the one thing I haven't mentioned that would also be very popular would be sharing a new book. So, for example, the latest Mark Twain book, perhaps. If you had a copy of the book, because we didn't have libraries yet, and if you happen to have a copy of that book and you could take turns reading from the chapters, that would also have been considered a wonderful way to help entertain your guests. So visitors to the Mother Colony House always notice the gun that's above the door back here. This is a double-barrel shotgun. It would have used black powder and ball shot. And the question always is why would they have needed a gun? It wasn't so much for protection as it was for hunting. So although they had their gardens and they had livestock, additional meat on the table was always welcome. And one of the things that the town would actually get together and do as a group of men and boys were rabbit hunts. If you were growing grapevines, rabbits were actually a predator. They would actually eat your grapevines down to the ground. So they would periodically go out and actually have these rabbit hunts. The plus was that the Germans loved rabbit stew. And so we have a very wonderful picture in the archives that shows this group of men and boys very proudly showing off their trophies of rabbits. And it took care of two problems at once. It fed your family, and it got rid of the pests. So bathing, just like laundry, was very time-consuming and only occurred once a week on Saturday night to get everybody clean and smelling pretty for church on Sunday. So during the week, people would make do with basically bathing out of something like this, which included probably cold water and just a rag. So on Saturday, Mom would have to haul in some water, heat it up on the stove, and they would fill the tub once. And Dad would get to go first because he works very hard. Then Mom would go next because she was going to have to help with all the other children. And then they would start with the oldest and work their way down to the youngest. And even if you had a family of 10, again, you would be using the same water. And that's why during the Victorian era, there was a saying, don't throw the baby out with the bath water. because by the time you got to the youngest child, it was going to be very dirty and murky, and you wouldn't be able to see the bottom of the bathtub. And then of course you had to haul the water back out, the dirty water back out. Actually, most of the time Mom would actually use it because Monday was going to be wash day probably, and she might throw the worst, the dirtiest, absolutely dirtiest clothing into that bath water and give it a really good soak. And then, because water was very precious in this area, and that way you would actually get the most use out of that water and also the soap that you had been using. So I'm going to welcome you into the kitchen of the Mother Colony house, but first I want to explain that during George Hansen's time, before the back portion of this house was actually added on, he would have actually cooked outside under probably a lean-to, especially for when it was raining or very, very hot. But that way, if there was any kind of fire, because they were actually cooking over an open fire, they would just lose the lean-to. They would not lose their house. Now, this continued during Mrs. Carrillo's time in this house because she actually added this space for bedrooms, and she still would have been cooking outside. We believe that it was probably our last actual resident, who was Fritz Ruhmann and his wife, who actually probably decided it was safe now to actually bring the kitchen into the house because of some of the newer inventions during the Victorian period. So one of the inventions from the Victorian era that allowed them to bring their kitchen inside was the fully enclosed stove, which would prevent the coal or wood from actually starting a fire in your kitchen. So one of the jobs that was very much very difficult for most women was actually ironing, because everything that you dried on the line was wrinkled and had to be ironed. So they had actually created these wonderful things called irons. This is called a sad iron, and after it's been heated up on your stovetop, it's going to be very hot, even the handle. So you're going to need to use something like this to actually hold on to it in order not to burn your hand. So the next invention, which would have been a major improvement for women, was one that had a handle that was removable. This would allow the base piece to be heated up on your stove, and then when you were ready to iron, you would just pick it up with the handle and you didn't have to worry about burning yourself. The third variety actually wasn't heated up on the stove. You would actually take hot coals from the stove, place it inside the iron, and it would be that heat which would actually be useful in ironing your clothes. Now the last iron is rather interesting. It's actually egg-shaped, and it was designed for something very specific. During the 1890s, ladies' sleeves became very puffy. They were called leg of mutton sleeves, and they could not be, that puffiness could not be ironed in with a flat iron. They actually would heat this up, and when it was obviously on a hanger, you would actually iron that fluffiness into the sleeve from the inside. So this was only used for that very specific purpose. So in the morning, Mom would get up and start her fire in her stove. And one of the types of things that you would provide for breakfast is something that you would use this for. We usually have our third graders guess what this is, and they usually guess a cheese grater. And I can see why they would because of these openings here. But this is what a cheese grater actually looks like. Okay. This is actually for a different purpose. And this is something Mom would have used in the morning to make toast for her family. You can do 4 slices. You would put this in the oven. She'd have to be obviously paying attention to it because you didn't want to have it in for too long, but you could make 4 slices at a time for her family's breakfast. Now, if she got up really early and had the ingredients, she might also want to make cornbread instead as a treat, special treat, maybe for Sunday breakfast. But you didn't want necessarily for it to be just plain in a pan. She could actually use something like this, which actually, when you take out the little cornbreads, are going to actually look like little corn on the cobs. And so that would be a special treat maybe for the family. So in this kitchen, we have what's known as a dry sink. And at the most, Mom might have had a hand pump on the end in order to pump water into her basin where she would have been washing her dishes. Now, one of the items I wanted to show you was this item. This item is called a soap saver, and she would have kept all of the little bits of soap that were done with the bar soap, and she would have put it in here, and then she would have swished this around in the hot water that she had put into her pan here, and that's how she would have created soapy water in order to wash her dishes. Now the reason it's slanted here is so that the water, as the dishes drain, is going to go back into the sink and then down the drain. Now we have a few items here, and remember, everything had to be made from scratch. So we have an old-fashioned egg beater here, and we also have something to make mayonnaise from scratch as well. But I wanted to point out this item. This is our vacuum cleaner. And you're looking at it and saying, that doesn't look like my vacuum cleaner. But what Mom had to do back then was she would actually have to drag her rugs out to the clothesline. She would drape it over the clothesline, and she would actually use this to beat the dirt or dust out of the carpet. And that's how she would actually have to clean it. Now think about how much more effort you would have to put into cleaning your carpets if you had to beat them with something like this than if you just had to use your vacuum cleaner, right? So I want to talk a little bit about the types of chores or jobs that children might have been given to help out in a family in early Anaheim. You have to remember, we were what's known as an agricultural community. And so one of the things that might have been assigned to some of the older children would have been to go out very early, probably before breakfast, and milk the cow. Because if you had children, you were going to need milk, and so you probably had your own cow. Well, Mom would have them bring the pail of milk in, and then she would wait, because she's going to wait until the cream comes to the top, because she wants to do something special with that. And this is something that the younger children could help her with. She's going to take that cream from the top of the milk, and she's going to place it in something like this. This is called a butter churn. And she's actually just going to open it up. She's going to place the cream inside the butter churn, and basically the kids are going to take turns beating that cream. Beat, 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 beat. And it takes a while, because you're having to put a lot of energy into changing that cream into butter. But eventually you're going to end up with basically a blob of butter. Okay? Now most ladies aren't going to want to put that blob of butter on their kitchen table because it doesn't look nice. So if you have somebody in your family who could actually carve things for you, one of the things you might have them carve is something called a butter mold. And you'll notice that it has a really pretty design inside, because you're going to pat that butter, that blob of butter, in nice and tight, and then this plunger is actually going to help push the butter out. And you're going to put it on a nice plate, and it's going to have this really pretty design on the top, so that when you put it out on your table, you can be proud of that butter that you put so much effort into making. Now, some of the other items that have been carved would have been very helpful, because if you, say, broke a bowl, or needed to replace your rolling pin or butter masher, if you had somebody in the family who, again, could carve, they could actually carve something for you, and you didn't have to wait until you had enough money to actually buy one. So this is actually a nice example of a potato masher. This is actually pretty primitive, but it would work as a rolling pin. And then, of course, our lovely bowl over there. But one of the things that's very decorative here are actually called cookie molds. And the Germans liked a particular kind of cookie. It's called Springerle cookies. And they would actually hand carve these beautiful molds, and would actually put the dough on top, and would actually roll it across the top, so that when they pulled the dough off, it would have the designs on the dough, as we have on these examples here. Now we have two examples that I like to show, because they're larger and you can see them easier. And they tell you a little bit about the Victorian era. So this one, as you can see, is a very long-legged bird. And what's really important, though, is what you can see it holding in its beak. It's a little hard to make out, but that's actually a baby. And that's because during the Victorian era, when children asked where baby Joe came from, the parents would say either that the stork had brought them, which is the long-legged bird, and left him on the front porch, or that they had found him under a cabbage leaf out in the garden. So the second one that I like to point out is this one here. You can see there's a gentleman over here, and if you look at him very closely, he is obviously St. Nicholas or Santa Claus. But what's interesting about him is that he is not bringing a big bag of presents to the children. He's actually bringing the Christmas tree. So during the early Victorian era, the parents would actually wait until the children had gone to bed on Christmas Eve, and then they would put up and decorate the Christmas tree so that when the children got up in the morning, they would feel that Santa had actually arrived and had brought the Christmas tree. On laundry day, one of the first things that they would have had to do would be to go out to the well and actually pump water into a bucket, and Mom would have had to heat all that water on her stove. The water would be poured into the container here, the tub, and soap would already be in there. Now you have two people doing two different things. You have somebody who's going to be agitating the water, and that's merely using the agitator, kind of looks like a plunger, to actually just move the water around and also the clothing. It's going to help to loosen the dirt. And then the really big job, which probably Mom or older sisters are going to do, is to actually scrub the clothes on the scrub board, because that's the only way to really loosen all the really hard ground-in dirt. And so they're going to actually have to do this to every piece of clothing, every towel, everything that they've got in here. And then they're going to rinse it. And in order to actually get as much water out as possible, if you were lucky and didn't have to resort to just hand wringing, which would be very hard, you're actually going to have what's called a mangle. And that's what this item here is. And basically, you actually use this to pull your clothing through. And what it's going to do is it's just going to squeeze the water out. And this is going to at least help a little bit so that you're not as exhausted as you normally would be after doing all your laundry. At this point is where you would actually take this to your line, your clothesline, and using the wooden clothespins, actually put this up on your clothesline. Now what's really nice is if it's in a nice sunny space, it's going to help dry it faster, but also it's going to help get out any really resistant stains. One of the advancements during the Victorian era was actually the first washing machine. And what was really interesting about this piece is that it is still, of course, something that had to be driven by hand or people power, and you could actually get your kids to help out with this. So it actually has two scrub boards inside. You would actually fill it with your hot soapy water. You would place one or two small articles between the two boards, and then you would have your kids do maybe 10 circuits with the handle, and they would know that that was ready to go. Now, of course, it's going to be hot when you're done, so we actually have an item here which was used to bring the article of clothing out of the really hot water into the rinse water. And so this would probably have been something that some of the older kids would have helped Mom with. But this would have freed up some of her time to do other things like ironing, which she probably would not have had any even the older girls do because of the possibility of burning yourself. I hope you enjoyed this virtual tour of the Mother Colony House, and I want to encourage you to go to the Anaheim Public Library's website and check out all the historic photographs that are available online that reflect Anaheim's early period. Thank you very much. Bye.